At 8:14 a.m. local time, the Caribbean looked almost too calm. The sea was flat, sunlight shimmered across the surface, and visibility stretched for miles. From the outside, it felt like an ordinary morning at sea. No storms, no nearby commercial traffic, nothing that hinted at trouble. But inside the Combat Information Center of a U.S. Navy destroyer operating legally in international waters, everything changed in an instant. A new surface contact appeared on radar, then another, then 3 more. Within seconds, 5 separate surface tracks lit up the display. Small naval vessels, low in profile, moving fast. At first, their course ran parallel to the American ship. By itself, that was not unusual. Venezuelan patrol vessels had shadowed U.S. ships before. Professional navies do that all the time. What made this different was what happened next. At 8:17, all 5 contacts changed course at the same time. Not randomly, not gradually. Together. Their new headings angled inward, tightening the spacing between them and the American destroyer. Their speed increased from a routine patrol tempo to something far more deliberate. 20 knots, then 23. The closest point of approach began shrinking quickly. On the bridge, the officer of the deck stayed calm. He did not need to raise his voice. Log the course change, maintain speed, maintain ROE. The rules of engagement were clear. The U.S. ship was not inside Venezuelan territorial waters. There was no reason to escalate, but that did not mean relaxing for a second. Every movement, every radar emission, every turn was now being recorded. Bridge-to-bridge hails went out. This is a United States Navy warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. You are closing distance at high speed. State your intentions. No response. The message was repeated in Spanish. Still nothing. By 8:20, the radar picture said more than words ever could. The 5 Venezuelan vessels were no longer just shadowing the destroyer. They were taking positions. 2 moved slightly ahead of the U.S. ship's bow. 1 fell back to port. Another widened out to starboard. The 5th stayed directly astern. It was not a hard encirclement. It was more subtle than that. A soft box. Inside the Combat Information Center, trackers updated vectors while electronic warfare specialists watched for emissions. So far, nothing openly hostile. No fire control radar, no weapons visibly trained. But intent is not always announced by dramatic action. Sometimes it is revealed through numbers, angles, speed, and distance closing minute by minute. At 8:22, 1 Venezuelan vessel accelerated again, pushing beyond normal patrol speed. Its bow wake sharpened. Infrared sensors showed a spike in engine heat. This was not drift. This was commitment. The American destroyer did not change course. That decision mattered. In encounters like this, the first ship to turn often loses control of the story. A course change can later be framed as avoidance, retreat, or an admission of pressure. The U.S. Navy understood that better than anyone. Presence was the message, not aggression. Still, the ship's posture shifted in quiet ways. Long-range optics zoomed in, capturing hull numbers, deck activity, and crew movement in sharp detail. Every frame was time-stamped, every second preserved. Below deck, the electronic warfare suite began cataloging faint signals. Routine surface search radar sweeps, low power, but deliberate. Someone on the CIC watch team said it softly. They're painting us, not locking on. Not openly threatening, but watching closely and making sure the Americans knew it. By 8:24, the nearest Venezuelan ship was inside 5 nautical miles and still closing. Crew members were visible near its forward gun mount. No one had taken up firing positions yet, but helmets were on and movements were purposeful. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding, and still the U.S. ship held steady. No alarms. No general quarters. No dramatic announcements. Just disciplined silence and precise logging. Because this is how modern naval confrontations are often decided. Not by who acts first, but by who makes the other side hesitate without ever crossing the line. At 8:26, as the distance narrowed and the formation compressed, one final internal note appeared on the destroyer's status board. Intent trending aggressive. That was the moment the situation moved from observation to response. Venezuela appeared to believe 5 ships were enough to apply pressure. They were about to see what controlled escalation actually looked like. By 8:27 a.m., the situation had clearly moved beyond coincidence. On the radar screen, the geometry no longer suggested parallel movement or casual shadowing. The 5 Venezuelan vessels had settled into a pattern naval officers would recognize instantly. Not an attack formation, but something just below it. Close enough to apply pressure, flexible enough to deny hostile intent afterward. Classic gray zone maneuvering. The nearest vessel, now less than 4 nautical miles off the U.S. destroyer's starboard bow, adjusted course again, only a few degrees, but enough to tighten the intercept. Another ship mirrored the move from port. The one astern crept closer as well, carefully preserving the spacing so the American ship could not reduce speed without seeming to give ground. Inside the CIC, voices remained calm and precise. CPA now 3.2 miles, speed 25 knots and increasing. Formation is coordinated. That last word mattered. Coordinated means command and control. It means this was not one captain improvising. Someone ashore or on another platform was likely monitoring the encounter in real time. The U.S. destroyer transmitted another bridge-to-bridge hail. This is a United States Navy warship. You are conducting unsafe maneuvers. Alter course immediately. Again, no reply. Then, at 8:29, something new appeared on the electronic warfare console. A narrow radar sweep, low power, surface search mode, but unmistakably intentional. "They're active," the EW officer said. "Surface search, they're tracking us." It was not a targeting lock. That threshold had not been crossed, but switching on radar while closing the distance still sent a message. "We see you, and we want you to know that we see you." On the bridge, the captain reviewed the feed without showing emotion. The rules of engagement were still in place. No weapons had been aimed, no missiles armed, but the threshold for a visible response had been reached. "Show presence," he said. That was all. The order moved quietly through the ship. Long-range cameras tightened further, capturing clear imagery of deck crews, mast configurations, and weapon mounts aboard the Venezuelan ships. Every movement was documented, every angle preserved. Below deck, the destroyer's 5-inch gun rotated slightly, just enough to be noticed through optics, not enough to be interpreted as direct targeting. A signal, not a threat. At 8:31, the Venezuelan formation tightened again. One ship surged forward, carving hard through the water. Its wake told the story clearly: maximum sustained speed. Engines pushed far beyond a casual patrol setting. This was no longer symbolic proximity. It was calculated pressure. And yet, the American destroyer still did not alter course. Speed held, heading held, silence held. That restraint was deliberate. In encounters like this, escalation is not always loud. Often it is quiet, professional, and designed to make the other side choose between backing off or stepping over a line they cannot walk back. At 8:33, deck observers reported visible activity near the forward gun mount on one of the Venezuelan ships. Personnel were moving into position. They were not operating the weapon, but they were close enough to signal readiness. Inside the CIC, the assessment changed again. Intent confirmed. Pressure maneuver ongoing. The captain gave a single nod. "Launch the helo." The order was not emotional. It was procedural. Within minutes, the MH-60 Seahawk's rotors were spinning. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the deck and banked low over the water. No flares, no aggressive movement, just a controlled climb to 200 feet, placing itself between the American destroyer and the nearest Venezuelan vessel. Its sensors came online immediately. High-definition electro-optical cameras, infrared tracking, laser designator, non-lethal but impossible to ignore. From the Seahawk's nose camera, the Venezuelan ship filled the frame. Engine heat signatures glowed bright. Crew faces were visible on deck. The image was sharp enough to read body language. Tense, alert, fully aware that they were now under close observation. Then came the transmission. "Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy helicopter. You are operating unsafely in international waters. Alter course immediately. Your actions are being recorded." The message was calm and then repeated in Spanish. For the first time since the encounter began, the Venezuelan ships hesitated. It was subtle, almost invisible to the naked eye. But on radar, it stood out immediately. Speed dropped by 2 knots. The lead vessel's bow shifted by a single degree, just enough to move away from collision geometry. They had not backed down yet, but the pressure had changed direction. Because the encounter was no longer 5 ships against 1. Now it was 5 ships against a system. A system that documented everything, escalated with control, and never surrendered the initiative. The next move belonged to Venezuela. By 8:35 a.m., the confrontation had reached its most delicate stage. The U.S. Navy Seahawk held steady at 200 feet, its rotors cutting through the humid Caribbean air in a controlled orbit. From above, the picture was unmistakable. 5 Venezuelan warships were no longer casually aligned. They were inside a tightening envelope around the American destroyer. Not an overt attack posture, but close enough that every captain involved understood how easily miscalculation could change everything. Inside the helicopter, the sensor operator tracked each vessel one by one. Hull numbers were logged. Crew positions were marked. Forward gun mounts remained unmanned, but personnel stood close enough to suggest readiness. Engine heat signatures confirmed sustained high output. These ships were not drifting, they were waiting. Back on the destroyer, the bridge remained quiet. No alarms, no raised voices, only data. The helicopter's full-motion video streamed directly into the Combat Information Center, layered over radar tracks and electronic intelligence. This was no longer just a visual standoff. It was a fully documented military encounter, unfolding frame by frame. At 8:37, the Seahawk adjusted its orbit, easing a little closer to the lead Venezuelan vessel. It remained well within safe limits, but the signal was impossible to miss. A brief pulse from the helicopter's laser designator washed the ship's bridge windows in a faint green glow. It was non-lethal, precise, and impossible to overlook. The radio call followed right away. Venezuelan naval vessel, you are approaching a United States Navy ship at an unsafe distance. Alter course now. This interaction is being recorded for international review. The message was then repeated in Spanish. For a few long seconds, nothing changed. Then the first shift appeared on the radar display. The lead Venezuelan ship began to slow, dropping from 25 knots to 22. Its wake shortened. The bow, which had been aimed directly into intercept geometry, eased slightly off axis. Not a withdrawal, not yet, but no longer a straight challenge. Inside the CIC, the watch supervisor logged the update. Contact 1 decelerating, heading adjusting. The Seahawk stayed exactly where it was, sensors fixed, optics steady. This was the kind of moment professional navies understand immediately. Pull back too soon, and you invite more pressure. Push too far, and you risk taking the encounter somewhere no one wants it to go. The U.S. response remained perfectly measured. At 8:39, the helicopter shifted attention to the second Venezuelan ship, the one holding wide to port. The camera zoomed in. Movement on deck began to slow. One sailor raised binoculars toward the aircraft, another stepped away from the gun mount. Then came the second adjustment. That ship reduced speed as well. Across the formation, the change began to spread. One by one, the Venezuelan vessels made small corrections. Nothing dramatic, nothing they could not later describe as ordinary seamanship. But the pattern was unmistakable. The soft box around the American destroyer was starting to open. No one celebrated. This was not triumph. It was control. At 8:41, the Seahawk widened its orbit, now circling both the lead and portside ships. Its presence remained constant, and its cameras missed nothing. Every radar sweep from the Venezuelan vessels was logged. Every course change was time-stamped. Every hesitation was preserved. This was the real strength of the U.S. Navy in moments like this. Not raw force, but discipline. One Venezuelan ship made a brief attempt to save face, adding a single knot before settling again. The helicopter did not respond. No extra warning, no sharper posture, just continued observation. That silence carried more weight than any threat. At 8:43, the Venezuelan ship astern, the last vessel still maintaining pressure, finally broke formation. It drifted back, opening the distance to more than 6 nautical miles. The encirclement was over. Moments later, a radio transmission came through for the first time. United States naval vessel, we are conducting sovereign patrol operations in proximity to Venezuelan waters. The wording was careful, political, and clearly shaped for later replay. The American response came immediately, calm and flat. This is a United States Navy warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. Your unsafe maneuvers have been recorded. Maintain safe distance. No argument, no debate, no course change. By 8:45, the Seahawk climbed slightly, moving to a higher observation altitude while keeping all 5 ships within sensor range. Below, the destroyer continued on its original heading, steady and unbothered. By now, the message was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy had not changed course. It had not raised its voice. It had not used force. And yet 5 Venezuelan warships had been compelled to adjust, quietly, gradually, and on the record. The encounter was no longer about pressure. It was about who had just lost control of the narrative. By 8:47 a.m., the tension had clearly shifted. What had looked only minutes earlier like a coordinated pressure maneuver was now coming apart in real time. On the destroyer's radar display, the tight geometry of the 5 Venezuelan ships began to loosen contact by contact. Distances increased. Headings drifted. The soft box that had been carefully built was quietly dissolving. No alarm sounded. No one declared success. The picture spoke for itself. The Seahawk remained overhead, its presence steady but no longer intrusive. From its orbit above, the aircraft's sensors captured the transition with clinical precision. The lead Venezuelan vessel, earlier the most assertive of the group, slowed again, from 22 knots to 19. Its bow shifted another degree outward, opening a wider lane of water ahead of the American destroyer. The second ship followed, then the third. Each move was subtle enough to avoid looking like a retreat. Together, though, they formed a clear pattern. The pressure was gone. Inside the CIC, the watch team tracked the changes in silence. Contact 1, opening distance. Contact 2, matching speed. Contact 3, drifting astern. The captain watched the display without comment. This was the outcome professional navies seek, not dominance, but control without escalation. At 8:49, the Venezuelan ships began to settle into a loose trailing line behind the U.S. destroyer, increasing their distance as they moved. It was a familiar posture, one meant to show presence without direct confrontation. A shadow, not a challenge. The American ship gave no response, no adjustment in speed, no turn, no acknowledgement. From the Seahawk's cockpit, sensor operators zoomed in on deck activity aboard the nearest Venezuelan vessel. Crew members who had earlier remained close to the forward gun mount were now stepping back. Helmets came off. One sailor briefly raised an arm toward the helicopter, not as a threat, not as surrender, just a human gesture in a tense moment. The helicopter held its position and kept recording. At 8:51, one final radio transmission came from the Venezuelan formation. United States naval vessel, we will maintain safe distance during our patrol. It was the closest thing to a concession they were willing to offer. The reply from the American destroyer was brief. Maintain safe distance, continue safe navigation. Nothing more. The Seahawk widened its orbit once again, climbing to 500 feet as the situation stabilized. Its sensors remained locked in, but the tone of the encounter had clearly changed. What began as a calculated pressure play had ended as a documented withdrawal. By 8:54, all 5 Venezuelan warships were beyond 6 nautical miles, holding parallel courses well clear of intercept geometry. The American destroyer continued forward without interruption, its wake cutting a clean path through open water. There were no handshakes on the bridge, no celebration inside the CIC, because this was never about winning a moment. It was about winning the record. Every maneuver, every speed change, every unanswered hail, all of it was now archived, time-stamped, geolocated, and impossible to dispute. In modern naval confrontations, the aftermath can matter just as much as the encounter itself. Video, radar logs, and radio transcripts often travel farther than any show of force. They shape diplomatic conversations, guide command decisions, and define the story long after the ships have moved on. Venezuela would later describe the incident as a routine patrol interaction. The United States would not need to argue in public. The record already did that on its own. By 8:57, the Seahawk received clearance to return to the ship. The Seahawk peeled away smoothly, banking back toward the destroyer's flight deck. Below, the Venezuelan ships were still visible along the horizon, still present, still observing, but no longer setting the tone of the encounter. As the helicopter touched down, the deck crew moved in with practiced precision and secured the aircraft in silence. The episode was over, not because of force, not because of threats, but because of discipline, documentation, and a course that never changed. 5 Venezuelan warships had approached a U.S. Navy ship, apparently convinced that pressure alone would trigger a reaction. Instead, every move had been captured, every angle had been answered, and the formation had been pushed to step back quietly without a single shot. And in the Caribbean that morning, that was the only result that mattered. By 9:02 a.m., the sea had returned to the same calm it had worn earlier. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. The U.S. Navy destroyer continued on its original heading, engines steady, sensors active, crew returning to normal watch routines. Far behind, the 5 Venezuelan ships lingered at a respectful distance, still visible on radar, but no longer affecting the destroyer's path or mission. The encounter had ended, but the real consequences were only beginning. Below deck, analysts started building the full record. Radar tracks were aligned with optical footage. Radio transmissions were matched to exact timestamps. Course changes, speed shifts, and sensor activity were reconstructed minute by minute. This was not drama. This was evidence. In modern naval operations, that stage often matters more than the standoff itself, because the real contest is not always fought on the water. Often it plays out later in the after-action report, the diplomatic cable, the command review that shapes what happens the next time 2 ships meet at sea. From a strategic point of view, the Venezuelan maneuver fell short at every level. If the goal was intimidation, it failed. If the objective was to force a course change, it did not happen. If the aim was to create a public relations moment, the opposite took place. 5 ships had tried to apply pressure. 1 ship had absorbed it without changing course. That imbalance is the real lesson. Venezuela's Navy understands it cannot match the United States ship for ship. Its strategy depends instead on friction, close approaches, ambiguous maneuvers, and moments designed to provoke a reaction. These are classic gray zone tactics, meant to stay just below the threshold of open conflict. But gray zone tactics rely on one crucial thing: the other side losing discipline. That never happened. The U.S. Navy's response followed a pattern refined over decades of similar encounters, from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. The steps are consistent. Establish presence. Record everything. Escalate carefully. Never give up control of the narrative. No warning shots, no sharp turns, no emotional decisions, just steady movement and relentless documentation. That restraint was not weakness, it was control. Because restraint forces the other side to make every choice visible, every acceleration, every hesitation, every decision to close in or pull back. And once those choices are recorded, they cannot be erased or reframed so easily later. Somewhere ashore, Venezuelan commanders would review footage from their own ships and compare it with what they knew the Americans had captured. And they would see the same picture the U.S. Navy saw, a maneuver that began with confidence and ended in quiet disengagement. No breakthrough, no advantage, no lasting gain. For the sailors aboard the American destroyer, it was simply another logged encounter. Another reminder that many of today's most serious confrontations never become major headlines precisely because they are handled the right way. No explosions means no viral clips. No shots means no breaking news banners. But that does not make these moments unimportant. They shape the future. They set expectations. They define boundaries. They teach lessons without bloodshed. The message delivered that morning was impossible to miss. Pressure alone will not move a U.S. Navy ship operating lawfully in international waters. Presence will be met with presence. Escalation will be answered with discipline. And every move will be recorded. That lesson reaches far beyond the Caribbean. Because the same playbook applies in contested straits, crowded sea lanes, and every region where rival navies test one another day after day. In the long run, the side that stays calm, stays predictable, and stays professional usually comes out ahead. As the destroyer moved forward through open water, its wake stretching clean and unbroken behind it, the 5 Venezuelan ships faded into the background, still there, but no longer in control. And that is how modern naval power is often exercised. Not through force alone, but through restraint so precise that it leaves the other side with nowhere to go. So here is the question that matters. In an era where one wrong move can spiral into a much larger crisis, is disciplined restraint the smartest tool a navy can rely on? Or does that kind of control invite the next challenge? Let us know what you think. Because out on the open sea, the most important confrontations are often the ones that never make a sound.